Quantum Mechanics Intervention by Paul Marostica. There are other matter theory sales promotion videos numbered in this series. My name is Paul Marostica. I have invented the unifying fundamental physics theory, matter theory. Matter theory can replace all 6 professional fundamental physics theories: ether, classical, relativity, quantum, the standard model, and string. I am offering matter theory to one funder and first user in an historic, temporary, exclusive first sale, satisfaction guaranteed. Later, I will publish it for sale worldwide. You will not learn matter theory from my videos, but you will learn about many of its important implications. Much of the illogic in quantum mechanics comes from trying to explain the results of various particle two-slit experiments. My video, Particle Two-Slit Experiments Explained by Paul Marostica, gives simple, physically logical field theory explanations of these results to replace the physically illogical quantum mechanics explanations. The field theory logic in that video will increase your understanding of the field theory logic in this video. So if you have not already viewed that video, you could first view that video and then view the remainder of this video. The dogs. It's the dogs. They have come to me as a pack and begged me to bark for them. They bark that their masters, who are all quantum mechanics theorists, have gone insane. They bark that they can smell the insanity diffusing out of their minds, even from a great distance. They want me to act immediately as their barksperson, to bark out, to try to help their masters, and others their masters might infect. I will now show video from one of my quantum mechanics psychiatric seminars, in the hope it will help end an ongoing worldwide psychosis which first began about 100 years ago with the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. Thank you very much for coming to this seminar. There are free coffee and donuts in the back anytime you want them. My name is Paul Marostica, and I do not have quantum mechanics psychosis. Some of you here already know I specialize in physically logical physics theory, and I'm now devoting some of my time to offer non-medical physics theory advice to the physically insane. Although the mathematics used in quantum mechanics is bizarre, it can be used to calculate probabilities consistent with the results of many physics observations. The psychiatric problems associated with quantum mechanics result from what some of its users illogically assume physically exists. Quantum mechanics is a physics theory which can have many physio-illogical symptoms, expressed both internally and externally as physically illogical assumptions. In explaining why various assumptions are physically illogical, I will use my own field theory intervention, in which I correct incorrect thinking using the logic of a field theory of my own interest and invention. This field theory logic should suffice for the intervention here, but will be significantly less logical than matter theory. Those of you with quantum mechanics psychosis, or QMP, will have a difficult time accepting that many quantum mechanics assumptions are physically illogical. But if you can accept what I am now going to present as serious physical logic, you will be opening your mind to a much more logical understanding of physics. So here are some physio-illogical symptoms, each falsified using physical logic, any of which qualifies you for a diagnosis of quantum mechanics psychosis. You assume objects are both particles and waves. Physically illogical. One object cannot be two contradicting things. Objects are composed of particles, and each particle has fields extending in all 3 dimensions of space. Objects are not both particles and waves. You assume particles are points. Physically illogical.
A particle has fields extending in all three dimensions of space, and in any one time each of these fields has one or more field parts in each position of space. Particles are not points.
You assume objects have uncertainties of position, momentum, time, energy, etc. Physically illogical. Objects are composed of particles, and each particle has fields extending in all three dimensions of space, and in any one time, in each position of space, each field has one or more field parts, each having a momentum, energy, etc., all having no uncertainties. Objects do not have uncertainties of position, momentum, time, energy, etc. You assume reality is probabilistic. Physically illogical. Because we are unable to always know or determine in advance what really will physically occur, we sometimes assume possibilities that might physically occur and then calculate their probabilities. But reality is not assumed possibilities, and it is not calculated probabilities of assumed possibilities, and it is not random possibilities in an assumed probability distribution. Reality is objects composed of particles having fields which can force, including self-force. Reality is not probabilistic. You assume an unobserved object is a probability density. Physically illogical. A probability density is a mathematical expression. It does not physically exist, and it has never been observed, not because it is unobservable, but because it does not physically exist. A probability density is a mathematical expression equaling a superposition or sum in all positions of space of the probability per volume of all assumed possibilities. The probability density is sometimes incorrectly called the probability amplitude wave function, which is its progenitor expression. Unobserved or observed, an object is always just an object. It is understandable that you might be confused about what physically exists. Fundamental particles have not been individually videoed or photographed. Assume there are two possibilities for an electron when it is observed: spin up or spin down. Someone having QMP might assume that when unobserved, both possibilities physically exist, and the electron physically changes to being the probability density of an electron which is 1/2 spin up plus 1/2 spin down. Not knowing any better, you might accept this. Schrödinger proposed a theory experiment so you would not be confused about what physically exists. Assume there are two possibilities for a cat when it is observed: fully alive or fully dead. Someone having QMP might assume that when unobserved, both possibilities physically exist, and the cat physically changes to being the probability density of a cat which is 1/2 fully alive plus 1/2 fully dead. Not knowing any better, you might accept this. But in reality, the assumed possibilities for the cat are just assumed possibilities. They do not physically exist. And the probability density of a cat which is 1/2 fully alive plus 1/2 fully dead is just a mathematical expression equaling the sum of the probability densities of its assumed possibilities. It also does not physically exist. What physically exists is what you would observe in a reality experiment, assuming those two possibilities for the cat are the only real possibilities: fully alive or fully dead. If you ever do try this kind of theory experiment as a reality experiment, please choose possibilities which do not involve harming an animal. So in reality, the assumed possibilities for the electron are just assumed possibilities. They do not physically exist. And the probability density of an electron which is 1/2 spin up plus 1/2 spin down is just a mathematical expression equaling the sum of the probability densities of its assumed possibilities. It also does not physically exist. What physically exists is what you would observe in a reality experiment, assuming those two possibilities for the electron are the only real possibilities, spin up or spin down. If you ever do try this kind of theory experiment as a reality experiment, please choose possibilities which do not involve harming a fundamental particle. Here are some more physiological symptoms of quantum mechanics psychosis, which are the results of combinations of physically illogical assumptions. You assume in a change between being unobserved and being observed, an object changes between being a probability density and being an object. Physically illogical. An object's probability density does not physically exist. An object is always just an object. So in a change between being unobserved and being observed, an object does not change between being a probability density and being an object. An object changing without being forced would not conserve momentum, energy, etc. Change between a probability density and an object is just a step in quantum mechanics mathematical problem solving called collapsing or expanding the probability density. It is mathematically related to collapsing or expanding the probability amplitude wave function. In a particle two-slit experiment, you assume any observed particle is a point which could only pass through one slit. So in trying to understand how such a particle could possibly interfere with itself, you assume that, unobserved, two of its different possibilities diffract through the two different slits and then interfere. Physically illogical. Two different possibilities of the same thing cannot both physically exist, and points could not diffract or interfere. Instead, the two different parts of the particle's field which happen to be directed toward the two different slits diffract through the two slits and then interfere. You assume an object changes between being a probability density when unobserved and being an object when observed. So you think an object knows when it is unobserved or observed, and so knows when to change between being a probability density and being an object. Physically illogical. Probability densities do not physically exist. Objects do not change in a change between being unobserved and observed, and unconscious objects do not know when they are unobserved or observed. In a particle two-slit experiment, you assume when both slits are open, two of its different possibilities pass through the two different slits, but you assume when only one slit is open, only one possibility passes through the one slit. So you assume that particles anticipate which slits will be open and interact accordingly. Physically illogical. Two different assumed possibilities of the same object cannot both physically exist, and unconscious objects do not anticipate future possibilities and then interact accordingly. Instead, any part of the field of a particle which happens to be directed toward an open slit can pass through that open slit. You assume an object instantaneously changes between being a probability density when unobserved and being an object when observed. Physically illogical. Probability densities do not physically exist. Objects do not change in a change between being unobserved and observed. And an object could not instantaneously change, because no change is ever observed to progress faster than the speed of light. The speed of progress of any change is determined by the mechanism transmitting the change, which would limit it to the speed of light or less. You assume an unobserved object is the probability density of its possibilities, and you assume possibilities and probability densities physically exist. So you think that assuming a possibility makes that possibility physically exist. So you think you can control reality with your mind by assuming what you want to physically exist and by unassuming what you want to not physically exist. Physically illogical. Assumed possibilities and their probability densities do not physically exist. So assuming something is possible does not make that possibility physically exist. So you cannot control reality with your mind. You assume every unobserved object is the probability density of all its different possibilities, and you assume when it is being observed, all of its different possibilities simultaneously diverge into different realities. So you think that, beginning with an unobserved probability density of all the different possibilities of our universe, when our universe is being observed, all of its different possibilities simultaneously diverge into different realities, either sporadically or continuously, and we are in one of those multiply diverged simultaneous universes. Physically illogical. An object is always just an object, so when it is being observed, it is not diverging into its different possibilities. So our universe is not diverging into its different possibilities. So our one universe is always just our one universe. There are many more physiological symptoms of this disease. New symptoms and variations of symptoms are constantly appearing, so I will not try to list them all. Any of the above physical logic is persuasive to those determined to be physically logical, but those with QMP commonly try to ignore it, argue that it is not provable, or deny it. Denial of physical logic is another symptom of this psychosis. Those with QMP can assume both that assumed possibilities and their probability densities physically exist, and that they are unobservable. So they can delude themselves that it is logical that tries to observe them fail, when in reality they prove they do not exist. Those paranoid with this disease will often try relentlessly to justify their delusions. Consider the many interpretations of quantum mechanics. Wikipedia listed 18 when I checked. This also is typical of psychosis. Those having similar psychoses disagree on the details and justifications of their delusions. All of this physically illogical thinking began about 100 years ago with physicists trying to understand some results of some reality experiments who confused themselves by making physically illogical assumptions. And since then, what these physically illogical assumptions have really contributed to physics is endless delusion and argument. Do not intentionally force your mind into psychosis. You can rid yourself of this physical illogic. There are 4 steps in curing yourself of quantum mechanics psychosis. Step 1 is admitting you have illogically assumed that objects are both particles and waves, that particles can be points, and that uncertainties, randomness, possibilities, and probability densities physically exist. Step 2 is realizing all this is only in your mind. In reality, none of this physically exists. Step 3 is accepting that, in reality, what physically exists is objects composed of particles, which have fields which can force, including self-force. Step 4 is always choosing to not accept physically illogical assumptions. You can cure yourself if you choose. Curing yourself will allow you to make significant progress in physics theory. You can always choose to be only physically logical. Just calm your mind and relax while looking at this nice reverse differential integrated Fourier transform of the first few hydrogen atom electron orbitals. Waking up, waking up. You will finally begin your journey toward peace and understanding in physics by remembering what you have learned here, and by supporting me in my historic first sale of matter theory and then buying my book. And now you are coming fully awake. Thank you all for your polite attention. I hope this helps. With the psychiatric seminar portion of this video now concluded, the dogs have just begged me to bark some things for them.
do not want to bark about any of this. You have ways of making me bark?
The dogs bark that they have received a $1 million grant toward making this video. In return, they bark the following. Snarl brand dog food is the snarliest. It makes your teeth their sharpest and makes your urine and your butt smell great. So remember, you can't always bite, but you can always snarl. I now have something else to add. I would be happy to participate, for a fee of course, in a more beneficial version of the Schrodinger's cat experiment, perhaps sponsored by a pet food company. In this more beneficial experiment, I propose that instead of the cat having no choice in the experiment and having the two possibilities of either living or dying, the cat has the two possibilities of choosing either to eat the pet food company's cat food or some other delectable cat food. Other more beneficial experiments are also possible. After the commercial is made, I'll insert a photograph here of me with the cat. No cats were probabilized in the making of this video. If you might like to become the historic, temporary, exclusive first owner of Matter Theory, I invite you to email me at paulmarostica@tbaytel.net. If you are interested in Matter Theory, I invite you to email me at paulmarostica@gmail.com. The end.